Okay, broadcast is live. We are ready to start. This is a roundtable as part of the Interpreter Foundation's series of roundtables. This year's discussion is of the Old Testament. The roundtable that we're talking about today will be the first in a series, hence we're going to have a little bit of background about the Old Testament, about the curriculum for this year, and then we'll talk about the first specific lesson, which is entitled "This is My Work and My Glory." It talks specifically about the book of Moses, and the main points that we're trying to cover here in this lesson are the concepts that we are children of God, that we can resist Satan's temptations, and that God's work and glory is to bring to pass our immortality and eternal life. For those of you who may be joining us for the first time for this roundtable, please know that it's being presented by the Interpreter Foundation, which is a non-profit foundation formed not by but to support the Latter-day restoration of the gospel as taught by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Its second purpose is to provide information to church members and to others who are interested in information. And the third is to defend against claims of critics. There's a lot of information that the Interpreter Foundation presents. They're all available on the same website, mormoninterpreter.com. My name's Martin Tenner. I'm on the bottom right of your screen. In the center of the screen is Stephen Smoot, who is joining us for this round table. And on the left side of the bottom of your screen there is Jeff Bradshaw, who will also be joining us. First today, I thought we might present some information, just generally speaking, about the Old Testament. I spoke with a couple of people in our ward during the last few weeks about how they felt that we were going to be studying the Old Testament, and the reactions were generally, "Oh, it's the Old Testament. That's so hard to understand. I don't get the Old Testament. It's so difficult to really apply into our lives." And so I thought, first off, we might be able to give a few suggestions about how to overcome some of those concerns that a lot of people have. One of those is that alongside of your scriptures, it might be useful to have a plain English Bible to read in tandem with it. And I'll give you an example of why here. If you were to read the King James Version of Job, chapter 39, verses 9 and 10, it would say, quote, "Will the unicorn be willing to serve thee, or abide by thy crib? Canst thou bind the unicorn with his band in the furrow? Or will he harrow the valleys after thee?" Close quote. I have asked tons of people what they think that means, and most people kind of scratch their head. If instead of reading just our King James Version, you were to read a contemporary English version of the same verses, here's what you would read, quote, "Would a wild ox agree to live in your barn and labor for you? Could you force him to plow or to drag a heavy log to smooth out the soil?" Close quote. A little bit easier to read. Part of the initial roadblock that a lot of people have to the Old Testament is the language is 400-year-old King James English, and it's difficult enough in the New Testament. When you get to the Old Testament topics that have a more distinct and ancient context than the New Testament even does, it gets more and more difficult. So just understanding the actual wording with a plain English version like the Good News Bible or perhaps the contemporary English version can be a really nice way to help enhance your understanding of the Scriptures. There are a number of those that are by good LDS scholars. There are also a number by others. This particular foundation is the Interpreter Foundation, sort of loosely named after the Interpreter Bible commentaries, which are not LDS, but do a great job also of describing in a fairly conservative way some of the things of the Bible. So that might be one that you might want to take a look at. When you look at the Old Testament, it's important to understand who wrote it and what the purpose of the story is. The setting for the story, the time period, and who the initial audience is. If, for example, you read through Isaiah and don't really understand who Isaiah is speaking to or why, or the context of the time that he's writing, you miss a lot. And the same is true of all the stories of the Old Testament. If you were to read, for example, about Lot's wife being turned into a pillar of salt as she looks back, a lot of people read that and wonder, what is the purpose for that? Pillar of salt, what is going on here? But if you look at the underlying purpose, which is very similar to a statement that Jesus made in the New Testament, that no one, having put his shoulder to the plow and looking back is fit for the kingdom of God, understands that the important thing once you have undertaken a task is to move forward and not look backward. Don't focus in on the past, look forward. Then you sort of get more out of the Old Testament story about Lot's wife and the meaning of look forward, don't look back, as Lot's wife did. Those are the same kinds of illustrations that over and over again seem to puzzle people about the Old Testament, but with a little bit of reflection and a good commentary, one can use for great, great advantage in trying to understand its contents. One final little thought or two, and then we'll turn some time over to Stephen Smoot about the specific contents for our lesson today, is the whole idea of a New Testament and an Old Testament. It's really kind of amusing in a way that the title to our scriptures is sort of a mistranslation. In the Old Testament, in Jeremiah chapter 31 and verses 31 through 33, it talks about the days that will come where God will make a new covenant with the house of Israel, not like the old covenant that had been made, which had been broken, but a new one. And then it's described in detail. It says that God will put his law in the people's inward parts and write it in their hearts, and he will be their God and they will be his people. And that's a description of the new covenant and the old covenant, which is really what the New Testament and Old Testament really means. And so as we look at the Old Covenant, keep in mind that in many ways this is a covenant that was ancient in origins and is in some ways outdated because of the new covenant that Jesus brought. And yet the stories that are contained within it are timeless stories that have endured over millennia of faith, of hope, of love, of courage, of endurance, of morality, and of goodness. And these are the very scriptures that Jesus himself read. Of course, during his lifetime, there was no New Testament to be read. And so Jesus gleaned his understanding as he grew from the very verses that we will be reading during this year. And it's a fabulous, fabulous study. So with that brief introduction and those short suggestions about how to approach the Old Testament, let's take a look at the specific topic for our lesson today, which is Lesson 1. This is My Work and My Glory, and ask Stephen Smoot if you would give us a little bit of background for this fascinating piece of Scripture that we're discussing today.
Sure. Thank you, Martin. Well, when we look at the book of Moses, it's interesting, Martin, that you talk about going to other contemporary modern English translations of the Bible, because Latter-day Saints specifically have a unique book that we can also turn to help understand and shed further light on the Bible, and that is what we now today call the Joseph Smith translation. Specifically, we have the first 7 or 8 chapters of Joseph Smith's revision of Genesis canonized in the Pearl of Great Price. We also, of course, have the Joseph Smith translation in our footnotes. You'll see a lot, or in the appendix. And a number of church scholars and general authorities have utilized the Joseph Smith translation in very fruitful ways to help shed light on doctrine and things like that. So when we look at the Book of Moses and the Joseph Smith translation, it's probably helpful to look a little bit about what the true nature of the Joseph Smith translation is. We sort of have it here, and many members of the church may assume that, you know, it's just like any other modern translation. They may assume that Joseph Smith must have been, you know, translating from Greek or Hebrew manuscripts to make this new rendition. But actually, there's quite a different nature in the Joseph Smith translation than what we typically think of a Bible translation. So I have with me the latest volume of the Joseph Smith papers, volume 1 of the Documents series, and they've actually reprinted the earliest surviving manuscript to Moses chapter 1 in the Joseph Smith papers. And what's interesting when we look at the early manuscript to Moses 1, the first thing that it says is that it is a revelation given to Joseph the Revelator, June 1830. So we know immediately off the bat that what Joseph Smith was doing with his, what he called the new translation, wasn't so much a translation from ancient biblical Greek or Hebrew, but rather by revelation or inspiration, he was guided to make changes and corrections and amplify our understanding of the Bible. And this is the project he undertook to help give us further understanding. So when we're talking about the Book of Moses, I think we need to understand that, you know, this is a revelation that Joseph Smith received. I think it's very likely that the Book of Moses contains information about the life of Moses that was never originally recorded in the Bible, or that just never, you know, was lost and never adequately preserved. And through revelation, Joseph restored this information. What's interesting about the Book of Moses, Moses chapter 1, besides the fact that it's the earliest, or one of the earliest revelatory documents that Joseph Smith produced, the date is June 1830, just 2 months or a month or so after the church was founded, is also there's a question of whether this was a part of the Bible or whether it was its own standalone revelation that was later incorporated into the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible. If you read the introductory comments by the church historians here, they say there's some ambiguity there. But regardless, we now today associate it with Joseph Smith's inspired translation of the Bible, and very appropriately so. And then the other thing that's interesting to note about the historical context is that the manuscript that we do have that's been used as the basis for our Book of Moses seems to actually be a copy of an earlier, now lost manuscript. There appeared to be indications that this was a copy, and that, you know, based on things like the punctuation and certain scribal errors that were committed and so forth. So that's something to keep in mind that's sort of interesting. One may wonder if there's possibly anything else in the earlier manuscript that, you know, maybe wasn't transmitted or was. It's an interesting question, but, you know, something else to keep in mind as we look at the Book of Moses. So with that in mind, with this understanding of the Book of Moses and its true nature, I think it really does help us as Latter-day Saints as a prophetic guide, you might say, to the Bible. This is Joseph Smith the prophet receiving this revelation and this information, giving us further details about Moses and about his interactions with God that aren't found in our current Bible today. So we are, of course, extremely blessed to have this as Latter-day Saints. It has very, very rich doctrine about the creation, about Adam and Eve, about the fall, stuff that you won't find in other contemporary Christian or Jewish understanding that's uniquely a Latter-day Saint understanding. And I think that, you know, we're definitely very, very blessed to have this information, and I think it's a good thing that the church in their curriculum makes it a point to study Moses 1 before anything else, to give us this proper context and grounding with this prophetic revelatory document.
Maybe I can continue to build on what Stephen's done in his excellent introduction to the history, and talk a little bit about really a paradox that's part of the Book of Moses and the Joseph Smith in general. And that paradox is that it was urgently undertaken by the prophet a couple of months, as Stephen said, after the church was organized, and it was by divine commandment that they did it. However, it seems like it was not intended for immediate publication, and that's really the interesting paradox 2 years into the translation, in fact, in 1832, Joseph Smith wrote a letter to William W. Phelps, who, from the context, it seemed was urging him to go forward and have it corrected by him and published. And he said, none of this translation, in effect, I can't quote the words exactly, is going to go out under my hand for correction or publication, and the will of the Lord be done. So it seems as late into that point of the translation, he did not feel it was going to be ready for publication. And although he reversed himself later on and felt at a later point in his life it was ready to be prepared for publication, this was apparently it gives you the feeling it was partly done for Joseph Smith's personal education and tutorial, and not necessarily for the world, at least at the beginning. Why do we think that might be the case? Well, if you look at the focus of the Joseph Smith translation, we often think of it as being even across all the different parts of the Bible, but in reality there's a special focus on certain passages. In fact, the first 1% of the Bible, which is Genesis 1 through 24, takes up 24% of the duration of the Bible translation, and about 20% of the changes are just in that 1% of the Bible, changes and additions. Now, why would that be the case? Well, why was that subject matter important? Well, first of all, of course, the story of Enoch was important as being part of the gathering, the establishment of Zion in those early years. But looking beyond that, we see the stories of Moses, creation, Adam and Eve, Noah, Abraham, and Melchizedek, really very temple-related themes, and themes related to the beginnings of the priesthood. And so I tend to look at the book of Moses in particular, and Genesis 1 through 24 in more generally, as a tutorial in temple themes and priesthood themes for the prophet, even apart from its later publication. It's also an interesting lesson on obedience there. After he got through Genesis 1 to 24, he received a revelation on Matthew 24, an amplification of that, D&C 45, and was told to move on to the New Testament. I like what Richard Bushman says about Joseph Smith in these cases. He was his own best follower, and that was exactly the case. The next day, he got up and, without any questions, started translating the New Testament. So that's an interesting aside. It seems as if the Lord was directing him to passages that were very important. Anybody else want to comment on that before I continue?
Just one thing briefly that I failed to mention as well. The value of the Joseph Smith translation, and you sort of touched on this, Jeff, a little bit, but the value of the Joseph Smith translation, besides just being, for our benefit as a guide or an amplification of the Bible, a prophetic inspired clarification of the Bible, is also how many passages or sections of the Doctrine and Covenants were directly inspired by the Joseph Smith translation, including very likely the Book of Moses. You have a number of sections, not the least of them being section 76 of the Doctrine and Covenants, that was specifically sparked or catalyzed as Joseph and his scribes and his brethren were working on the new translation. So I think for that reason as well, we can very much appreciate this labor that Joseph undertook to give us this inspired revision of the Bible, both for what it clarifies in the Bible, as well as for what it offers us in its own standalone revelation and covenants.
Very well said.
So great. Could I add one other quick little comment here about the general nature of the Joseph Smith translation before you get into the specifics, Jeff? The Joseph Smith translation is really an interesting document because there are parts of it that Joseph Smith describes as a direct translation by inspiration of an ancient document. There are other parts of it that, as both of you have very correctly described, are more along the lines of an expansion or an elaboration or a divinely inspired commentary. And so it's important when you look at the Joseph Smith translation at different parts of the Old Testament or the New, that you take a look at the context for the writings. There are some cases where theoretically, if somehow you could go back and find the original document and compare it, we believe that it would be a very accurate translation. There are other places where Joseph Smith was clearly expanding the message and the meaning, and if somehow you could go back and find the original document, it would not say anything close to what Joseph Smith says. He's expanding the information and adding commentary or additional ideas to it. And so it's I think, important to keep that in mind to understand exactly the nature of the Joseph Smith translation. And finally, Jeff, you made a great point, and that's that this was really, when you get right down to it, even though it's part of our scriptures, it was a work in progress for Joseph Smith. He never said at some point, I'm done, this is finished, it's complete, it's exactly the way I want it. That just never quite happens, so we ought to keep in mind the possibility that there are some places that may not be completely the way that he would have wanted them to be in the final analysis. So,
what you say is very true there at the end. In fact, Brigham Young reported the prophet as having told him later on in his life that he wanted to go back through the Joseph Smith translation again and to revise it with respect to some passages he'd been restrained from putting in some things in during the first pass. So it seems as if he was being guided in terms of what we were ready to receive in that translation process. Let me just say a few words about the book of Moses, chapter 1 exactly, and I think as Stephen's going to elaborate a little bit more, it fits squarely into the heavenly ascent literature. And what we mean by heavenly ascent is not the figurative journey toward God as we experience in our temple ordinances, but an actual encounter with God in the heavenly temple. Both, of course, fit the same kind of pattern, and so if we look carefully at the book of Moses, chapter 1, we can see that pattern not only in an ascent to God in the literal sense, but also in the temple ordinances. That pattern really has two major parts. One is the descent, as it were, and we can think about that in terms of our experiences in the temple. There's a moving away from God there, and then an ascent, a reverse direction, as it were, where we come up to the presence of God again through the ordinances. That descent begins with the prologue, verses 1 and 2. Then there's an initial vision that I think of as being in the spirit world, because of some of the content of that. We can talk about that more later, perhaps. Verses 3 through 8. So we have to be careful. There's actually a vision at the beginning of all things in chapter 1 of the spirit world, one at the end, where you may remember he sees every particle and all the different worlds. Sometimes those two visions get mixed up. There's a very otherwise excellent seminary and institute video where you see the vision of Moses 1, and those two different visions are mixed up, and because those aren't really distinguished very well, it can lead to some misunderstanding. So again, it starts in the spirit world, and then in verses 9 through 11, Moses falls to the earth. And of course, he's losing his strength, perhaps, and it's a little bit like Joseph Smith's experience, where he has been overwhelmed physically. But I think that has a very significant spiritual sense. He's now he's come from God's presence to the telestial world. And we know from parallels in other documents, such as the Apocalypse of Abraham, there's a specific passage in there that talks about Abraham, in this case, falling to the earth at this part in the same pattern of vision. On his ascent, you'll see that ascent comes through ordinances. First of all, he defeats Satan, and there's a baptismal motif there in verses 12 through 23. If we look for it carefully, motifs of water, motifs of conflict, and finally Satan is made to depart. After 3 times, he departs when the name of the Lord is invoked. Then Moses calls upon God and hears a voice. Notice he's not seeing God anymore. It's as if God is separated from him by the veil. And we have that motif all through the ancient literature of God's voice through the veil. Ziusudra, in the Mesopotamian literature, when he hears about the heavenly council, their plan to flood the earth, he's listening through a partition, very much analogous to our veil when he hears those things. And here, again, it's very specific in saying he's hearing a voice, verses 12 through 23. He's praying to come back into the presence of God, as it were. And then we see an interesting vision at the veil as he's passing through. And there's an interesting phrase, as the voice was still speaking, we find in verse 27 that has a direct parallel in other ancient literature that seems to signify as he's going through the veil and then he receives that vision, like other prophets, who when they pass through the veil and are looking from the inside of the veil down, gain a knowledge of all things, corresponding to the Egyptian picture, the eternal round, and corresponding to later on the vision Moses received of creation and the fall. And then Moses is in the presence of the Lord. He asks the questions. He receives that beautiful passage about God's work and glory being the immortality, the eternal life of man in the presence of God. And then finally an epilogue that contains especially an injunction to secrecy that goes on with the idea of this being a sacred account in verses 41 and 42. So now with that broad picture of descent and ascent, maybe Stephen would like to kind of talk about that heavenly council and the idea of him being a son of God.
Sure. Well, I think I have to say, first of all, to any of the listeners out there, that Jeff's commentary on this in his book, In the Image and Likeness of God, I think it's called, is remarkable. So I highly recommend you go and look at it more in depth, this idea of Moses as an ascension text or as a temple text, because it's quite wonderful how it works in that context. But one thing that's also pretty interesting to me, at least, is in Moses chapter 1, beginning in verse 4, but also again in verse 6 and 7 and elsewhere, Moses is called God's son. He says, "Thou art my son, therefore look, and I'll show unto you the workmanship of my hands." In verse 6 he says, "Moses, my son, thou art in the similitude of mine only begotten." And then again in verse 7 it says, "Moses, my son, thou art in the world, and now I show it unto thee," and so forth. So Moses is being called a son of God. And a little while ago I was wondering, what possible significance there might be in this Moses being called a son of God. And the reason why is because in ancient Israelite religion, to be a son of God, a B'nai Elohim, usually has in reference to divine beings who are members of God's divine council. The Hebrew word ben, that's usually translated as son, can also more broadly mean something like somebody who belongs to a particular group or a tribe or a class of some sort. And you see this throughout the Hebrew Bible, where you have the sons of, for example, the sons of the perfumers, or people that work in perfume. The sons of the prophets was the name of the group Elijah and Elisha were involved with. Sons of virtue, sons of the east, sons of Zion. So for Moses to be called a son of God, I believe is significant in that this is God affirming Moses has some sort of divine status or divine title that he has gained through this ascension journey of his. There's other hints in the text that this is a council setting. For example, in the Psalms and in the book of Isaiah, usually the divine council is depicted as meeting on the top of a tall mountain. So Mount Zaphon is in the book of Isaiah where the divine council meets, and Moses 1:1 says what? He was on the top of an exceedingly high mountain, right? So there are these interesting clues that to me suggest that this is a divine council text where Moses is following this pattern where he goes up into the divine council in this ascension procedure. He's given a divine commission. He's supposed to preach or deliver a message for God, and then he's going to be sent back down to earth to do it. That's a pattern that appears elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, and it's pretty clearly laid out here in the book of Moses. I also think this understanding of Moses as a son of God, meaning he was a member of the divine council, also sheds light later in Moses 1 when Satan comes along, and Satan in verse 12 says, "Moses, son of man, worship me." And Moses says, "Who are you? I am a son of God, in the similitude of God's only begotten." And I think it's very likely that what was happening here was Satan was trying to demote Moses, as it were, from his status in the divine council. He was trying to pull him down from his divine role and make him just like anybody else, right? A son of man, or a Ben Adam, a human being, right? So I think it's wonderful that we have this context, this beautiful divine council ascension context from Moses 1. It makes it a very dramatic opening. It makes it very powerful and dramatic. But it also links the book of Moses to the ancient world. As Jeff has pointed out, and I'm sure he'll elaborate a little bit more, we have other ascension texts that follow a very similar pattern. we can see very similar convergent themes in Moses 1 and in his other ancient Near Eastern texts describing this ascension divine council setting. So for those two reasons, I think it's very exciting to read Moses 1 in this context. It helps us understand what's going on here in the setting of the text, and it also gives us ancient world. And I think it's very unlikely that Joseph Smith would have been able to just come up with this on his own. He certainly would not have been able to read these other texts that we've been discussing, since these were all discovered later. I'll mention, for example, that the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are at least 2 Qumran texts that talk about Moses becoming like God and ascending into his angelic council. The Dead Sea Scrolls, of course, weren't around in Joseph Smith's day. It would have been impossible for him to have known about this sort of thing. So, it's fun to look at it from this dual perspective, both in what the text says itself, but also as evidence for Joseph Smith's inspired restoration of this ancient revelatory material.
Excellent. Yeah, I guess I'd like to go into just one of those texts, ascent texts, that it was just a very exciting find from my perspective. There are several LDS authors who discuss the apocalypse of Abraham, but usually they compare that experience to Abraham's experience, put it in an Abrahamic context. But when the idea occurred to really line this up with Moses chapter 1, there were just some striking resemblances. The Apocalypse of Abraham, its most complete text, is in a 14th century Slavonic version called the Sylvester Codex, and the text is usually dated to the 1st century AD, but I believe it has some older elements in it. One of the neat things about it, besides all the parallels with the Book of Moses chapter 1, including some that I mentioned, like the fact that as he was passing through the veil, it says, as the voice was still speaking. It has the fall to the earth, similar to Moses, but it has 6 very beautiful color drawings in it that really illuminate what's behind the text. Let me give you a couple of interesting examples from the perspective of understanding how Moses' experience fits with ancient temple themes. For example, we have them wearing robes, and in the robes they're wearing and the gestures they make, they differ in the different hands that are being used and in the way the robe is positioned on the shoulders. And you see that as they transition through the story. You see the angel Yahuel representing the Lord, who has bird-like wings, and his role is very similar to the angel in the facsimile number 1 of the Book of Abraham. You see a hand clasp being used from when Abraham is raised from the earth after his fall, which gives you an idea then again of his beginning of his ascent. And then another hand clasp is used during the ascent to the presence of God. And one of the most fantastic pictures is at the end where Moses and Yahuel enter the presence of God. It's an anthropomorphic God sitting on his throne. They're looking at him face to face. What makes that interesting from a text perspective is the text says, God's face you're not going to be able to see. God's presence you're not going to be able to see. You're not going to see God. And yet the picture, in contradiction to that text, actually shows them meeting God face to face. And it shows a series of cloth veils surrounding God, showing that he's beyond a series of veils that are there. I won't go into all the parallels, but it's interesting as he finishes the ascent, then the next step is he's able to ask questions of God, and then he sees a vision of the creation, the garden, and the fall. Just as Moses, after chapter 1 of the book of Moses, in chapters 2 through 5, is led by the Lord to see a vision of the creation, the fall, and the garden. So it's a very striking text and very much worth our study. And like a lot of those ancient texts, I guess what we bring to that text helps us understand the Apocalypse of Abraham. And the Apocalypse of Abraham, along with these beautiful pictures, helps us understand, I think, our own scriptures and the way ancient temples worked.
I'll toss out one quick comment here as a follow-up to what Stephen said. You mentioned that the Dead Sea Scrolls were not around and available for Joseph Smith, and that is certainly true. Some time ago, I had a critic of the church. He actually happened to be a minister in another church, and I won't go into detail there, except to say that he had a big criticism of the book of Moses, because he said you couldn't possibly have Satan as part of the whole context of a divine council. That's just ridiculous. If you go to the book of Genesis, God has to come to earth, which is the place where Satan is found. And then I pointed out to him that at the beginning of the book of Job, you have this divine council, and there's this conversation going on between the B'nai Elohim, the heavenly council, with Satan. Satan was there, and they're talking about Job and whether or not he would be faithful if he were tested. And so this whole context that Joseph Smith has given us by inspiration that we find as part of the book of Moses has actual precedent, at least for that part of it, within the Bible itself, in a context that most people rarely look at and rarely even observe, because it's sort of a prologue to the whole book. And I just find that a great confirmation of the revelatory nature of the book of Abraham. So, other things that Stephen, you wanted to comment on here, or Jeff, or
not much I can think of other than just to reiterate, I suppose. Martin, you sort of mentioned that there's biblical precedence for this sort of thing going on, this sort of ascension into the divine council. You mentioned Job, which is a beautiful illustration of this exact phenomenon, the divine council meeting together. One thing that I found in my research was a number of other non-Mormon biblical scholars who were saying the same thing. They were pointing out that the early Jews around the time of Jesus, who began to fully articulate these traditions about Moses, not just the Essenes at Qumran, but others, some of the rabbis, some of the Samaritans, and some of their surviving documents, they were all drawing from Exodus chapter 7, yes, I believe chapter 7, verse 1, where Moses is said to be like God unto Pharaoh. And so I find it wonderful that we have non-Mormon confirmation here saying, as you said, yes, to put the divine council in this sort of setting is absolutely has precedence from the Bible. Early Jews understood that, and these traditions they made about Moses in the divine council, they were drawing from these biblical texts. And so, again, sort of a nice cohesion there between the book of Moses and our Bible that we have today, going off what we said earlier about the fact that here we have additional details springing from Joseph's translation of Genesis that add these wonderful details.
I'd just like to share, building on your comments, Stephen, and yours, Martin, on sort of the increasing scholarly evidence for these things. I think I won't go into the particulars, but I was sitting in the living room of a very well-known international scholar on the Bible, non-member of the church, as I was studying the book of Moses and explaining, in particular, Moses 1 and some of the related materials in the Apocalypse of Abraham. And this scholar shook the head and just simply said, Joseph Smith can't have made all this up. And that was very striking to me to hear from someone of this person's expertise. I really believe that's the case, from the perspective of knowledge and understanding the light and truth that brings to me. There's just no question to me that this was inspired from God. And for Joseph Smith, as for me, this knowledge was not only a source of power and salvation, but also one of comfort. I like something that Joseph Smith said about some of the truths that he'd had. He said, I am glad I have the privilege of communicating to you some things which, if grasped closely, will be a help to you when the clouds are gathering and the storms are ready to burst upon you like peals of thunder. Lay hold of these things, and let not your knees tremble, nor your hearts faint. To me, when I read these very powerful spiritual experiences, such as Moses had, the fact that he was, through his priesthood and the power of God, able to overcome any challenge that Satan threw at him and come into the presence of God, gives me hope for my own life and for the lives of those whom I love. And I'm very grateful to the Lord for sharing this wonderful document with us and to the prophet Joseph Smith for making it happen.
Wonderful comment. One final thought that I have, and that is that the whole purpose of this first lesson is to bring about in the minds of the people who are in the class a few important concepts. One is that we really are the children of God. And for Latter-day Saints, this is not a metaphor. This is not some illusion by analogy or something, as you might find in another faith. We are not part of the Protestant genre where there's this unbridgeable gulf between the nature of God and the nature of man. For us, it's so literal that if we were able to actually finish up our genealogy and go back to Abraham and then go one step further, the next person on the chart would be God, which is a pretty amazing thing if you stop to think about it. We are literally the children of God according to our belief system. Another important concept here is that, contrary to all the movies that we see today and popular cultural ideas that might say the powers of darkness cannot be thwarted, and if you put yourself in a bad spot, you're toast. This message says that you can, even when you're face to face with Satan or some other evil, you can have Satan depart. You can gain the upper hand. You can resist whatever the devil puts in front of you. And that's, of course, something that's quite famous from the Doctrine and Covenants as well, but it's reiterated here in the Book of Moses. We really will never be tempted beyond our ability to withstand. And the final part that comes out of the lesson today that I think is so really important is although we are at a humble early state, I believe, in our development, and that's pretty clear to me if I were to try to personally compare myself with God. There's no question there's a pretty huge gap there, but God's work is to bring to pass the immortality and eternal life of people, of us, of you and of me, and that shows the grand potential that we have, just as our young children have a wonderful potential to become just like their parents. And we as members of the church believe that that is literally true, that we can become very much like our heavenly parents. And those are all comforting, wildly different thoughts than you would find in many other faiths, but very, very important for Latter-day Saints to understand. I'm grateful very much for those. Any other parting thoughts here from either of you gentlemen?
I'll just say very quickly to add my voice to both yours, Martin, as well as to Jeff's, that the Book of Moses is a wonderful text. I absolutely love what Joseph Smith called it, well, at least as it's reprinted in the history of the church. Joseph Smith is talking about how he was going through a particular hard time through some early persecutions when he says, we received this, quote, precious morsel, and then he goes on to quote Moses 1. And I absolutely believe that, as Joseph Smith said, it's a precious morsel for us. And I also appreciate the words of one of my professors, Stephen Ricks, when he said, Joseph Smith will also a restorer of ancient doctrine. And I think the Book of Moses is absolutely wonderful for both the doctrinal application, which you've so wonderfully clarified, Martin, and as well as for understanding of this is linking us with the ancient world, and how blessed we are to have a modern prophet that was able to do this for us.
We are. Well, thank you for listening to our broadcast today. This is the first in the Old Testament series of roundtable broadcasts. Join the Interpreter Foundation for a roundtable discussion on each of the Sunday School Gospel Doctrine lessons for this 2014 calendar year.